So I think we'll give it a start. So noswaith dda pawb a chroeso. Thank you everyone for joining us. Good evening. My name's Zoe Thomas and I work for Helpu Cymru for the supply chain team and including the area of animal health. We're very pleased to have teamed up with the Welsh Veterinary Science Centre to bring you this webinar tonight. It's great to see a combination of farmers and vets with us. So thank you for joining this webinar, Tip of the Iceberg. Just before we start, I just wanted to make a note that it is being recorded and we may use it on our website later on. So we've got Kate Overs here to discuss what is contributing to thin sheep and to tell us a bit more about the new test, Enferplex, that can help us tackle iceberg diseases in sheep through improved detection. HCC were lucky enough to have Kate's help on the Stock Plus project, a health planning project for sheep and beef. It was flagged during that project that thin sheep and sheep fertility was a recurring theme with Welsh farmers. Kate is a qualified vet for around 40 years, Kate?
41 and counting.
41. I wasn't far off. With a particular interest in sheep, a member of the NSA Cymru committee and was the chair from 2020 to 24.
Yeah.
And a director of the Welsh Veterinary Science Centre, which does occasional days on post-mortem duty and facilitates CPD for vets and farmers. And she was also the past president of the Sheep Veterinary Society. At home, Kate farms a hill farm with her partner Elwed, and they keep a variety of Welsh hill breeds. Just before I hand over to Kate, if you have any questions, could you please put them in the question and answer box and not the chat, and we will answer them at the end of Kate's presentation. But if we do run out of time, don't worry, we will make sure your questions are answered and we will get the answers back to you as soon as we can. Okay, so when you're ready, Kate.
Thank you.
For this. So thank you for joining this webinar, Tip of the Iceberg. Just before we start, I just wanted to make a note that it is being recorded and we may use it on our website later on. So we've got Kate Overs here to discuss what is contributing to thin sheep and to tell us a bit more about the new test, Enferplex, that can help us tackle iceberg diseases in sheep through improved detection. HCC were lucky enough to have Kate's help on the Stock Plus project, a health planning project for sheep and beef. It was flagged during that project that thin sheep and sheep fertility was a recurring theme with Welsh farmers. Kate is a qualified vet for around 40 years, Kate?
41 and counting.
41. I wasn't far off. With a particular interest in sheep, a member of the NSA Cymru committee and was the chair from 2020 to 24.
Yeah.
And a director of the Welsh Veterinary Science Centre, which does occasional days on post-mortem duty and facilitates CPD for vets and farmers. And she was also the past president of the Sheep Veterinary Society. At home, Kate farms a hill farm with her partner Elwed, and they keep a variety of Welsh hill breeds. Just before I hand over to Kate, if you have any questions, could you please put them in the question and answer box and not the chat, and we will answer them at the end of Kate's presentation. But if we do run out of time, don't worry, we will make sure your questions are answered and we will get the answers back to you as soon as we can. Okay, so when you're ready, Kate.
So, fairly obvious. Why are thin ewes a problem? Well, they don't perform well, less fertile, more barons, poorer scanning. They don't produce as much milk, which affects your rearing percentage. The lambs don't grow as well, and lambs are more susceptible to diseases. And particularly going forward with wanting to be more carbon neutral or possible effects on the environment, the one real thing we can do with our premium product of sheep and beef is to improve performance or get optimum performance from them. So next slide. Okay, body condition, very important. For the vets among you, there's an excellent article in Practice written by Valentina Bussin on ill thrifty news. Very practical, goes through most of what I'm doing in this talk, and I'd certainly recommend having a look at that. If you're a BVA member, you can download it from the website. If you're not, find a colleague who is. And then we've got a quick picture of the HCC fact sheet on body condition scoring. Next slide. So some of the causes, next slide. Sorry, you're going to, if you want to just keep clicking through these, Larry. So we've got lame sheep. I should have said there'll be some gory photos. So if anybody is eating their dinner and doesn't like gory photos, we had liver fluke. There's a lovely picture of Haemonchus, the barber pole worm. And in a minute, you'll get a picture of a ewe with a very pale eye, which could be fluke, or this is Haemonchus. Possibly even you get paleness because you get loss of protein in Johne's disease as well. Keep going. We should have another. Yes, teeth. She's missing her middle two teeth. And although the front teeth aren't as important as the back teeth are, well, yes. A surprisingly large cause of poor condition in ewes when we get thin ewes in for post-mortem to look at. Keep going, Larry. So, lameness. I'm just briefly going to go through all these causes. We know about lameness. We have the tools to control it. There's lots of other good webinars out there as well. But lame ewes spend less time grazing. There's plenty of work to show they're more likely to die. They're more likely to be barren. Their lambs are more likely to die. And their lambs are less likely to fatten. So they cost money. And although we have the tools, lameness is still a significant cause of poor condition in ewes in the UK flock and possibly worldwide, actually. Parasites, adult sheep, we're thinking particularly worms, Haemonchus worm and fluke, and also sheep scab as well. Carry on, next slide. So a little bit about Haemonchus, barber's pole worm. It's the one worm that adult sheep don't really get an age-related immunity to, so you can see problems. When I qualified a long time ago, I was told I only needed to worry about it if I went to work in the Southern Hemisphere or maybe Cornwall or a bit of Devon. But the worms are present all over the UK now and causing problems. And certainly we've seen more cases in Wales in the last few years. Speaking from doing a little bit of goat work, we seem to see quite a bit in goats as well. So, you know, the figures that an adult worm can suck 0.05 ml of blood a day, they do produce lots of eggs and have a very short cycle. So they produce them quite quickly. When that says worm burdens they have been recorded to have worm burdens as high as 100,000. So that's 5 litres of blood, but that sheep isn't going to live long enough to lose another 5 litres the next day, probably. But if you get a very high egg count, particularly in adult sheep, it's always worth asking for the stain, the peanut antigen stain, whatever it's called, that will tell Haemonchus eggs, because the eggs look similar to the other summer worm eggs. The only ones that look different, you can tell by the eggs, are nematodyrus. Quick plug for the Welsh Sheep Vets group, and next meetings in April and May, and I've got one slide just encouraging you to join any vets that aren't members yet, who do have work in Wales. Sian Mitchell, expert parasitologist, recently retired from Carmarthen, really practical, is going to talk on Haemonchus at our next meetings. So next. Liver fluke. Yeah, chronic liver fluke, gorgeous picture that, I think. Maybe that's a bit strange to think that's such a lovely picture, but I put that up because that is a stunning picture. Not seen as much. When I was in Wales Veterinary Science Centre week before last, I did have an acute fluke case. That was possibly the first one we've had. Much later this year, chronic ones with lots of adult fluke. That's when you get sheep that are getting thin, might eventually die. They lose protein. And when you post-mortem them, that's when you see that sheep don't really like to die. You can see these chronic scarred livers that you think, how are they surviving? I know they're thin, but how are they surviving? And just a reminder that both climate and adaptation of the mud snail and the liver fluke means the timing of applications can be different every year, which makes it difficult of us as vets to advise farmers and difficult farmers to use the right product at the right time. And that's all down to testing and knowing your farm as well, and looking for looking for alerts for when there might be problems. Next slide. Teeth. I have put teeth in. These are some pictures from a thin new project that Philippa Page was involved with. And there were some postmortems of 2 or 3 thin news on the farms. And these are pictures from Carmarthen VLA. Those are front teeth. The next slide will show us the next 2 slides, if you want to go on. I mean, the one on the right is that mouth on the left, with the skin taken off, but to show just how that tooth, the third molar, you can see pointing sideways, how painful that must be, poking out into her cheek all the time. And that one, you can just see what we call a wave mouth. Quite difficult to look at the back teeth of sheep, but if you feel well along the jaw, you can often feel bumps and lumps. And sometimes I find you can poke a finger through if there's a tooth actually missing. Sheep with teeth like that, it's a one-way ticket. Next slide. Nutrition does have a big impact. If we're looking at flocks where a lot of sheep across the ages are in poor condition, you're thinking things like parasites or maybe nutrition. And yes, we can go and have a look and see the sort of very short brown grass, not a lot of nutrition there. But also remember, when sheep are housed or you're feeding, it's not just the quality of nutrition, it's the actual feed space they can get to. There's quite a hierarchy with sheep. There's dominant ones and ones that are much shyer. And if there's not enough space for them to get in, then those shyer sheep will not be eating nearly as much. You might work out how much they want per head, but they just all need to be eating it as well. But if you've ruled out all the things we've just been talking about, and you're putting your sheep onto good nutrition and they're not improving, then we start thinking about some of the diseases, some of the iceberg diseases. Next slide. So yes, so what are iceberg diseases? So they're a group production limiting diseases, so they're affecting condition and rearing, but they can cause a range of clinical signs and they have a long incubation period. So symptoms are not always specific and they're a bit subtle in the beginning. So by the time there's obvious issues in the flock, disease is often well established. So that's why we call it the iceberg. You see the tip of the disease, but there's all that you're seeing below the surface in the flock. And that's true for individual flocks of sheep and probably the position in the UK flock as a whole. We get diagnoses from bloods and from postmortems, but there's a lot more bubbling away below the surface. Next slide. Thank you. So some of the clinical signs, unexplained thin news, particularly in the younger and middle-aged groups. Most of these, or some of these diseases, they'll often pick up when they're younger, but the incubation is months to years. And a whole range, more barren ewes, reduced scanning, reduced rearing. 2 of them particularly have respiratory signs. You may have some lameness, mastitis with MIDI, also neurological. Weak lambs with all of them, and particularly with border disease. So on the right side there, HCC have got some really nice fact sheets. They're good for us all to read. They're aimed at farmers, and will probably explain better than I'm going to do this evening. So I'd recommend you have a look at those. The other one, the reference, is the AHDB iceberg diseases book, which is more detailed. It's aimed at vets and farmers. It's an excellent resource if you want to look into this further. It's got information about the diseases, about testing. It explains, again, possibly better than I will tonight, but it will also explain why no test is 100% accurate, and there's some case studies on there as well. And that was produced by Nottingham University with some expert sheep vets like Fiona Lovat, Piers Davis, Emily Gascoigne. I think Piers might even be on the talk tonight. And I probably shouldn't have started talking names because there's 3 or 4 other people there as well. But that can be downloaded from the AHDB website. So if you want more details, certainly recommend that. Next slide. This is a slide I have borrowed from Philippa Page. Thank you very much, because I'm not very good at drawing circles and lines and things, so it was much easier to catch a slide, and she's already put the salient points on. So these are the 5 diseases that we call the iceberg diseases: CLA, Maidi-Vissner, Johne's disease, OPA, and border disease. And if you look around there, we've got some common thieves: wasting, ill thrift, high mortality. That's both from deaths and from a higher culling rate as well. So yes. And now I'm just going to go through the diseases in a little bit more detail, but not too extensive detail, because I could go on all night and then you'll have all given up. But I'll try not to expand too much. I very easily go off target a bit, but I'm starting with Maidi-Vissner. As an industry, I think we for too long thought of this as a disease you have to blood test to prove you're free to sell certain pedigree breeds and take some of them to shows. And because it's been a low level of disease slowly creeping up in the UK flock, we have for too long not really taken it as seriously as perhaps we should. It's primarily a lung disease, lung and udder in the UK, which is the Maidi part. The Vissner part affects the brain and causes neurological signs. They tend to see that more in Scandinavian countries, but you can occasionally get that here: a bit of dragging a hind leg, a bit of hind leg lameness. But the lungs, they get invaded by the Maidi, this virus. They become really firm and heavy, and they stop going in and out properly. So the poor sheep are not breathing properly, so they're not getting the oxygen, which isn't getting to the red blood cells. So they're just not getting the energy, and they're not getting the right nutrition going around in their bloodstream as well. At post-mortem, the lungs are very heavy, and I'm sorry I didn't have a picture of these, but at post-mortem, lungs are usually pink and quite squashy when you pick them out. These are not always grey, but they're not quite the nice healthy pink colour, and they're very heavy. But it can also affect the udder, and the first sign might be just lambs not growing well, because there's some hardness in the udder and the ewes aren't producing milk as well. The first time I ever saw Maidi was when I was asked to do, was quite a long time ago, I was asked to do a report for a welfare case, and the farmer, his own vet, had recently diagnosed Maidi. They were working together to try and come over it, but he had a higher number of ewes that were thin and cull, and he was feeding them to try and get them fat to send them off. He was feeding them in a sheltered place on his farm, which had 2 public footpaths going through it, which is probably why he got reported. Also, his lambs weren't growing as they should, so he got a lot of poor lambs. He did have some anthelmintic resistance, but not to all the drugs, and mainly the lambs were getting a very high worm burden because they weren't getting much milk. So they were grazing early, and so the season for replicating, for picking up worms, then producing eggs going on the ground, and it all happening again till the eggs got to very high numbers, was getting longer and longer. And no doubt this had been going on for several years till it became to a head, and it was quite an eye-opener to me. And certainly Emily Gascoigne, a lovely sheep vet I know through the Sheep Veterinary Society, she's spoken to Sheep Veterinary Society at least once, if not more, about her experience with Midy in some commercial farms. She's in practice in the Dorset area, quite a wide area there, and some commercial farms. Again, diagnosis wasn't until probably over 50% of the flock were affected, and then it becomes very difficult to know what to do. You can do a lot of testing and snatch lambs and try and get a clean flock. It's quite expensive and difficult. You could think about culling the whole flock, but how are you going to know? There are accredited females you can buy, but probably not enough to go round. So Midy particularly, but all of the diseases, this is why we want to know before it gets to a stage that it's a struggle to know what to do. I'm not saying if you get to that stage, there's nothing you can do, and there's a lot of consultation between vet and farmer to try and find a path forward. And I'm not going to go too much on any single disease, but just reiterating, if you know when it's a small problem, then hopefully you can keep it under control better. Same with all of these. Next slide, please. So OPA, ovine pulmonary adenocarcinoma, which is a contagious tumour of the lungs caused by a virus. This fluid that comes out, often when they're dead, that's typical. Not all the sheep that have OPA produce that free fluid. There is something called the wheelbarrow test, where you pick the back legs of the sheep up that you think might have OPA, and this fluid pours out their nose. It's probably not recommended to do for two reasons. One, you're half drowning the sheep. It's particularly unpleasant and stressful for them. So if you're doing that, you should think about probably euthanasia fairly quickly afterwards. But also that fluid with that froth in is just hooching with virus, so you're just spreading the infection. On the right hand side, we've got the lungs with the bottom half is pale, and that is hard when you cut into it, and that's the tumours. They start as lots of little tumours and then they all grow together. Next slide, please. Johne's disease. Here we've got some nice gut pictures. There's two. It affects the gut, mainly the small intestine, the ends of the small intestine. It causes the lining of the gut to get really thick, so it can't do its job of digesting and absorbing food. There are two strains, cattle and a sheep strain. The sheep strain is quite often pigmented, that yellow colour at the top. Sheep can get the cattle and the sheep strain. Cattle can get both strains, but they seem a bit more resistant to the sheep strain. But this is relevant if you've got cattle as well as sheep, and particularly if you've got cattle that you're trying to get accredited for Johne's disease as well. But it's significant to the sheep if you've got cattle with Johne's. And whereas with cattle, they lose condition and they have a projectile scour, they produce lots of watery scours. Sheep don't tend to get diarrhea with it. They probably only get diarrhea if they've picked up a worm burden as well, which they might do, adult sheep, because they're no longer healthy, or sometimes at the end, what we call terminally. They generally just waste away and become poor. So again, quite difficult to diagnose. Next slide, please. Border disease, this is the BVD of the sheep world. So those of you who have cattle will know about testing for BVD. But it's very similar in that it's important if pregnant sheep are infected for the first time, and you can get barren ewes infected in early pregnancy, later on abortions and stillbirths, and you can get weak lambs born and ones with neurological shaking. The classic hairy shaker. Personally, I see less of the classic hairy shaker. You see some, but the most recent couple of cases I've dealt with border disease have really just had, more barons, few stillbirths, and just weak, not doing very well lambs, but also some doing okay. So this picture, the lamb was shaking a bit, but that's just showing my lack of photographic skills because it's a bit blurry. That lamb actually, and I put that one in just to remind me off subject, looked like a classic hairy shaker, but this actually had Schmallenberg in the first outbreak, and we'd had a few with Schmallenberg, and this was one of the last to be born, a normal twin, and this one was just like really poor, but it didn't have rigid legs or an undershot jaw, although all the rest did. But it was just it did eventually fatten to not a very big size, and but go. But that's just to remind me we are seeing quite a bit of Schmallenberg this year, but there's also quite a lot of own reported Schmallenberg that may or may not be. Some descriptions I've heard may or may not be. And just to remind you all that the testing for Schmallenberg is free at the moment because we want to do surveillance and know where it is. You have to pay for dead lambs and abortions and stillbirths that look classical. It's taking a bit of brain out and sending it away. Otherwise might be blood testing. So there's a fee for blood testing and postage, but the actual lab fees are free. So I would encourage anybody who thinks they may have Schmallenberg, the farmers among you, to talk to your vets and see about getting some samples taken, because the more that we know about it, the better. Next slide. CLA, this causes abscesses in the lymph nodes, particularly around the head and neck in the UK, as you can see the picture there. Also in the udder, in front of the udder, which can burst and cause mastitis or can cause poorer milk as well. And if you get them in the scrotum, they'll affect fertility. It will also cause internal abscesses. They seem to see a lot more of that in the southern hemisphere than we do, but we do see cases of it, and we've had post-mortems, and if you've got internal abscesses, that will affect condition as well. Next. So what can we do to test? Well, there are blood tests for MIDI, CLA, border, and Johne's. The testing for Johne's is, when I say tricky, 20 or 30 years ago, you almost thought the testing was not accurate enough to really do in sheep. Testing has improved a lot. It's a particularly difficult disease to look for because you don't get the antibodies early on in the disease. There's what we call a latent period where the sheep are infected and not showing signs. And then there's early stages of disease when they'll often not show positive. And then there's the late stages when they're really poor. But it's still worth blood testing to know whether it's a good test to know whether disease is present in the flock. The blood test is probably less accurate to find individual affected animals. You can also take feces for Johne's. You can look for the organisms or look for a PCR test. There are no blood tests for OPA. Various places have been working on it over the years. Hopefully in the future we will have something, but there's very low. There is a PCR test, but there's very low level of virus in the blood, so it will rarely go positive. So currently the only test is ultrasound scanning of the lungs, which can be very effective in trained and accurate scanners, but it's very much it's operator affected. I did a little project on this recently because we had some training at Wales Veterinary Science Centre. Phil Scott, who developed the technique and is an expert in the technique, runs training in Scotland, but we've had him down to Wales 3 or 4 times now. And I had a group of vets who did a project to show their ability before and after the training. And I'm pleased to say after training, nobody misdiagnosed normal lung. But it's not 100%. And sheep have a lot of pathology in their lungs. You might get a lot of abscesses. Again, another reason we say sheep don't just like to die. They will go on quite happily with quite large abscesses sometimes, so which can confuse a bit to the OPA tumour because they quite often have a little abscess in the middle as well. But generally, training certainly improves. So as vets, it's great to get out and scanning, particularly, you know, if you've been trained, but make sure your farmers are aware of the limitations. As farmers, also be aware of the limitations and decide what you want to do. If there's a few that you're not sure whether they're OPA or abscesses, it's absolutely fine for you to decide. If it's an animal of high genetic merit, you're probably going to want to put it separately and rescan it. If it's a cullew, you might just decide to cash it in anyway, whether you think it's OPA or an abscess. But, you know, those are things to discuss. And with all these tests, we need to be open about the limitations. Probably the gold standard for all of these would be post-mortem. You can diagnose by what we call a gross post-mortem, opening up, looking for all the changes, and then we take slices, fix them in formalin and send them away to be looked at under a microscope for an absolute diagnosis. But with post-mortem, just sending one thin ewe in can be very misleading. So that's why it's always better to send more than one case if possible. And well, when I say post-mortem, it is possible for things to get pluck back from cullew abattoirs sometimes, and they could be looked at for OPA and MIDI as well. And just one little anecdote, clients several years ago I had with increasing number of thin ewes. I went and post-mortem one, she got dreadful teeth and she got a lot of liver fluke, despite her being treated with Fasinex or equivalent 3 weeks before. So we diagnosed triclebendazole resistance on this farm. We did a lot of work. We got liver fluke under control. But 2 years later, you said, yeah, majority much better, but I'm still getting a few more, not like it was, but more thin ewes. And then I did another post-mortem and we found OPA as well, which was no doubt there in the first place as well. So one post-mortem is great, but don't expect it to be the whole answer. Next slide. So yeah, no test is 100%. You've got a difference between sensitivity and specificity. So your true positives, sensitive, and your true negatives that are specific. So as I said, for Johne's disease, sensitivity for all the blood tests is not high. It's lower than sensitivity for things like MIDI, which means there will be positive sheep that don't test positive. The specificity is pretty good, so you don't get many positive, you don't get many false negatives. Sorry, you don't get many false positives, yes. So you say, I've told you about all these horrible diseases. Do I want to know? I started off with saying a lack of perceived impact, certainly of MIDI. And I hope I haven't scared you too much, but I hope I hope I've convinced you that there is an impact in flocks in the UK and can be quite a considerable impact. There are various studies on the cost of disease. It can be difficult to work it out on your own farm because there's other factors, a bit like the last case I said, there was the factor of liver fluke as well. So other things can be going on. You don't know how much to put to a specific disease. There's a cost of testing. And if you're going to eradicate, if you've got a severe problem in a flock, as I alluded to, if you decide to start again, where you're going to get your high health replacements. But is there a demand for a known or a high health replacement? I do think maybe not as far as accreditation, which is, it's not freedom from disease, but it's nearly there. Maybe there's a demand for something like the Yonis scheme in cattle, where you'll have sort of green, orange, and red, so you know the kind of risk. And there will be a market for the higher risk ones in flying flocks, people who just want to breed from them for a couple of years and then they go off. But people who want a permanent flock and maybe breed their own replacements out of might want to have a higher health. So yes, and the thing is, if you find out it's positive, what's next? So, and that's where farmer, that's where the vet is there to advise the farmer and work forward. There's nothing going to be a quick fix. Next slide. Yeah, so something's positive. What do you do? We talk about managing, culling, maybe even just being stricter about culling thin sheep, separating older and thinner ewes, because if they've got one of the diseases, they're likely to be spreading them to the others. Managing things like MIDI and OPA, they're respiratory diseases. So you may be thinking about housing, not housing, or housing for a shorter time, or even whether you can separate age groups, or certainly separate your thinner ewes before that. There is a vaccine, so Johne's disease, although it might be difficult to find the individual sheep that are affected to cull them, you can start vaccinating, and the vaccine is given to lambs definitely before they're 6 months old, and ideally between about 4 and 12 weeks. And the reason for that is that they usually pick up the disease when they're young, and it's spread in milk and muck from affected sheep. So other managing is clean, if sheep are in, cleaning out the sheds more often, and just general hygiene. There's also a vaccine that can be imported for CLA, and probably a lot of commercial pedigree ram breeders do vaccinate, and say none of the blood tests differentiate between vaccinated and infected animals. So if a flock's vaccinated for CLA or Johne's, then most of those animals will show signs of antibodies on blood testing. Also genetics, there's some MIDI Visna work on less susceptible animals. There's a K gene that if sheep have both of those K genes, they are much more resistant to MIDI Visna. So while they might be exposed to the virus, they're far less likely to get disease. And there was a project between Nottingham and Morecambe, which will have finished, but I haven't actually, and I know they published some data about the level of resistance in different breeds, but I'm not sure about the final results of the project. Although I did see this year, I picked up a flyer at the Royal Welsh that the blue-faced Leicester sheep breeders are looking at MIDI Visna resistance testing as a breed, and encouraging people, and they referred you to their website, which I found nothing on, and I've checked again today. I didn't find what that's on, but they are looking to do some blood testing. So in the future, looking for animals that are resistant to different diseases as they become available, as testing becomes available. Next slide. So now talking particularly about the Enferplex testing, which tests for 3 of the iceberg diseases. Wales Veterinary Science Centre were delighted to have some financial support from NSA Cymru to purchase kit and train staff and run the multi-ELISA testing service to look for MIDI Visna, CLA and Johne's. And sensitivity and specificity had been demonstrated. It's a test that's used by GD in the Netherlands and has been used in a healthy goats project in Norway to eradicate diseases in their goat herds. And there has been, and they've validated it for UK conditions with blood tests from UK sheep as well. The MIDI may be more sensitive than some of the other tests available, which is good in some ways, but it may show up some positives where you're perhaps not expecting. Time will tell with that. We're looking to add BVD in the future. And as part of the validation, we've at Wales Veterinary Science Centre, we've had some positive and negative bloods that we've sent over to Ireland, where the Enferplex company and lab is, to validate the test before we add it into it. So really what we'd like to know is the incidence of iceberg diseases in Welsh flocks, and how can we help? Can we help with management plans? In the long run, should we be looking at some kind of, health traffic lighting or health testing? I'm not going to say accreditation, but some kind of scheme. And I would say the test is available to all. It's not just Wales. And certainly in England, in their SFI support at the moment, there's funding for endemic diseases. So it would certainly fit in with that. Next slide. And this is the technical bit. And I'm not an immunologist, but I think we got, if you ask me any technical questions, I'll probably refer to Neil if he is on here. So really what we're saying is the kits come with the different antigens, which are the different bits of the different diseases at the bottom. Those are those coloured triangles. You put your sample in, and if there's antibodies to those diseases, they match up, the colours of the different diseases. And then in the lab, they add a conjugate that sticks where you've got an antibody sticking up, as you can see for those blue bits. Then it goes through some substrate that, well, chemiluminescent means a chemical that illuminates. So that sticks those illuminating bits on, and it goes in a machine that picks up the light, basically. And you get little spots of light, and where the spots are tell you which diseases and which proteins from those diseases it's picked up. Next slide. Oh, I think, do you want to just keep clicking through this slide? Yeah, so on the left, that white one, that's lovely, is a typical ELISA test that you might have heard of. And this is the same format as an ELISA, but we've got the little spots are put in each well for the different diseases. And then you put the serum on and do the other things. And the top right, not the Enfer bit, the bit where you've got the edge of the plate and little bits of light coming up, and you can see those black circles with little white dots. It's those little white dots that, well, when I say we read, the computer system reads and puts it into a spreadsheet for for the lab, but it reads those dots and tells you what the results are. So next slide. And this is the multiplex, just means it's doing multiple testing in one little well, which is one bit where you put the blood. So we're testing for more than one disease with one little bit of blood. And so we've got 2 proteins from MIDI, 2 from CLA, the one Yoni's one, and then the blank one that's our control. Next slide. And this is the relative sensitivity and specificity for MIDI and CLA. And those are relative to the ELI test, which is a recognised test. So they will run against those using that as sort of a gold standard. And if anybody wants to know more about that, we can, there are the proceedings that was all presented at. Yoni's, as I've said, it's challenging to define because there isn't a gold standard blood test. So it's interpreted bearing in mind that, that the history and how the sheep are. but it's comparable to all the other tests. So all the blood tests for Yonis are certainly better than nothing, but they're a screen to show what's in the flock. Next slide, please. And this is showing the cost of it. This is off the Wales Veterinary Science Centre. This is a run of the various blood tests we do. And that's the cost of the lab fee. So the top one, the flock screen to do CLA, Yonis and MIDI. It's to do 30 sheep, well, 16 to 30, which is a good level to do a good flock screen to know if those diseases are there, 375 plus VAT. It is 10% off to NSA members to acknowledge the support from NSA Cymru while that funding is still there. And there's a current short offer of 30% off we've got 2 farmers talks, one coming up in Aberystwyth in a couple of weeks, and then there'll be one nearer South Wales a couple of weeks later. So attendees of those or this webinar can have a 30% off. I think that might be till the end of April, but I can confirm that. And you'll need, to the farmers on this, you will need a code that HCC will be able to give you. To the vets on this, you will need the code to put on the paperwork. But also, even without that, if you're sending bloods in and you downloading the paperwork, ask your clients whether NSA members or not. And I think there's a tick box for that for the paperwork. The plates come with plates of 90. So ideally, we like to sort of arrange for 2 or 3 lots of samples coming in either from the same practice or different practices, similar time. We've recently had bloods from the Farming Connect. They're not Focus Farms now, whatever, whatever they're called anyway, sorry. But those have all been offered. We haven't had from all of them. Those have all been offered screening. Yeah, and next slide. Also, as I said, postmortems are a good way as well, and that's just showing you Wales Veterinary Science Centre, which will be the same if you're nearer to Shrewsbury VLA or Carmarthen or Liverpool. They will be very similar. So you can see post-mortem on 1 adult sheep is £78 plus VAT, but up to 3 is 110, which is less than less than the cost of 2 sheep. You do still have to pay for disposal, which you probably should do anyway, £25, which is what we are charged for collection. And that fee includes all the testing. So sometimes we do a post-mortem. It's what we call a gross post-mortem. You can actually tell what the animals died with, and we just do a few tests to confirm. But sometimes we have to do a lot of testing, things like bacteriology, sending swabs away, histology, looking at things under the microscope. For Yonis, we'll do a scrape of the gut and look at that under a microscope, and also send gut for histology. So those things all cost, and they can cost quite a lot, but you only pay the one fee. And that is subsidised. APHA also pay quite a bit towards it, because otherwise it wouldn't cover the cost of all the extra testing. So that was just a bit of a plug for that as well. Next slide. So yes, I think this was just to say that the Enferplex test has been used in the Healthier Goat scheme for eradicating contagious diseases in Norwegian goats. So can be used for goats as well as sheep. And in goats, the goat equivalent virus of MIDI, it causes CAE, contagious arthritis, cephalitis. So yes, and has been quite prevalent in some goat. Yeah, on a completely other side, goat's colostrum is excellent for lambs, and you could be quite surprised. There are a few milking goat herds around the place, and they will sometimes, sometimes they'll be quite happy to sell you some colostrum that you can put in the freezer in proper amounts. But Yonis is not uncommon in some goat herds, so ask about the health status. There's a lot of them that test, but not all of them do. Next slide, please. All right, we'll just very quickly go through this. I was going to hide these on my slides or else I'd have gone on far too long. But that was just saying this scheme, they were blood testing with Enferplex. They were snatching goat kids. And before the test started, on the left, you've got the average daily milk yields, and it's a lot higher after the scheme. Next slide. Well, just these slides, I'm just going to go straight through those. They were just showing the Enferplex being tested against the existing test, and just to show that, they were similar. For the negatives were negative and the positives were positive. Do you want to flick through all these, Larry? Well, the summary. Yeah. So yeah, in this, the Enferplex is a multiplex chemiluminescent antibody test. So it's looking for antibodies to detect against MyDCLA and Yonis. And the sensitivities and specificities were comparable to those of other ELISAs. We're generally using it with serum at Wales Veterinary Science Centre, but it should be, certainly if you were do contact us if you've got, say, goat herds that are milking that you may want to do milk samples, because that's easier. Do contact us to discuss. As I said, can be extended to include other diseases, and we're definitely hoping to include border disease. What I should have said about border disease is looking for antibodies is to tell you if border disease is present in the flock, much like you do with your young stock blood testing in cattle for BVD. If you then want to find the PIs to eliminate them, then that's going into a PI hunt. And BioBest Labs and possibly one of the others will do composites where they pull 10 bloods and run a screen. And if it's negative, those animals are okay. If it's positive, you decide whether you want to pay to have the 10 done individually, or say you're just going to get rid of all those 10. So if you are going to look for PIs and you're blood testing, it's worth doing different age groups. So for example, you do the ewe lambs in lots of 10, because if you've got plenty spare and you just get 1 or 2 positive pools, you might decide it's better to send them off fat. And also your older ewes, you might decide you'd cull them rather than finding which were positive or not. And much like BVD in cattle, although you get a lot of poor sheep and a lot of problems, you can get PIs that grow well and are fertile and do breed. And I've certainly been involved in cases where it's probably been a few years after a PI has come in before border disease has been evident, and you can trace it back to to female sheep that have brought it in. Males can as well, yeah. So definitely worth looking for. Again, when I qualified, we were told that animals, PIs with BVD, would always die, and we now know that's not true. And PIs for border disease, if they get pregnant, they will produce a PI animal as well. And the PIs just push out lots of the virus. Next slide, please. Just quick plug. I'm coming to the end now. I don't think I've overrun too much. Sheep Veterinary Society, it's good value. Any younger graduates on here, it's excellent value. There's an annual 2 or 3 day conference per year, and usually an online. This year, the conference is in September, and it's in Llandrindod, Wales. So I hope we'll get a huge, a huge support from Welsh vets and vets all over the UK and all you border vets. They also have resources on the website, and they've recently started a private Facebook group where you can chat and ask for help. And I did advertise this on here at short notice, but very friendly and informal society. Next. big plug for the Welsh Sheep Vets group as well, and any vet that treats sheep in Wales. We've got quite a few border vets in it. We have 2 or 3 meetings a year, well, 3 or 4 meetings a year. The South meetings we meet at the Castle Hotel in Llandovery. Mid and North we've moved around, but we now meet, the last time it went down well, at the Monty Club in Newtown. I've already said Sian Mitchell is going to talk about Himoncus and get discussion going at the next one. She'll come to Llandovery, but she'll join us online in Newtown. We've also got a WhatsApp group, really friendly, really helpful, share case studies, always friendly advice, get some disease updates, free to join, sponsored currently by MSD for the meetings, a room hire and a hot meal, and to help me organise it. And if anybody wants to join, you need to email or text or WhatsApp me. And if you don't have my details, send an email to Wales Veterinary Science Centre or to HCC and they can put you in touch. As I say, the WhatsApp, you don't have things on there every day, so you don't get bombarded. But if you've got a difficult case on a Sunday, excellent place to put it and get some helpful advice. Next slide. Oh, next slide, please. So, yeah, 2 slides just to say thank you for NSA Cymru, who built funds up and want to spend their funds helping the sheep industry. Very kindly use some of the funds to support purchase of the equipment. It's funded by its membership of sheep farmers and also by different projects. And they have a role in promoting sheep farmers' positive contribution to the economy, environment, culture, and society. And, you know, people always say, oh, what do NSA do? If you get involved with them, you would realise the huge amount that NSA head office and all the regions do. You get involved. You might think you're not making a difference going to the meetings, whether it's with Welsh government or with national government. But if you're not there, you make less of a difference. So generally being there. Yes, that just flicked through. So also they run webinars and do all sorts of things. And there are some benefits for members, not just the Sheep Farmer magazine. There's various other benefits. But yes, thank you. So that was a quick run through, although I don't think I've gone too much over time. That was a quick run through of things I could have spent half a day talking about. So I hope it was interesting. And I think there are some questions. Can I see them?
Yep, thank you, Kate. I'm just trying to get back to you. Let me get the questions up now for you. Right then. So I've got one. What time of year would you test the news? Is there anything that can be done now?
Yes, you can test them any time of year, but generally a time to be pulling out your thinner and underperforming ewes is around scanning, just after scanning, or maybe after weaning when they've had time on some better grazing and they haven't picked up. And after weaning, you may be going through the flock, an easier time to get them into blood tests, and also this time of year.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think we've probably got time for another one before Zoom kicks us out.
Yeah, I think Piers has commented about pool. I forgot to mention that you can do pool feces as well as individual. I certainly use that a lot. You can send them away. You can do 5 sheep and you can send them away to look for PCR, to know whether you've got whether you've got yonis in the flock or not. I have tried. I personally, on 3 or 4 cases over the last year, have not found blood testing individual sheep that useful. I've had a couple that on post-mortem were yonis, but weren't on an ELISA. But that's just, you know, it is a test I use. It says blood testing appropriate for confirmation in individual use. It's certainly a test I use, but I don't take a negative as negative from it. A positive is positive, but a negative isn't negative.
Thank you. We'll have one more question then. When doing testing on large flocks, is the number needed to test similar to smaller flocks or a proportion of the flock? Should age groups be looked at separately if managing separately?
Uh, No, it would be rare for an age group to be managed separately through its whole life. Um, the validation was done of 30 on all size flocks. So yes, as you know, if they're so much separate in that you've got flocks grazing different mountains, or you've got a flock that's on the mountain and a flock that's on the ground, then they're not going to have any contact. So you would want to do two different ones. Otherwise, no, just doing a representative sample and concentrating on your high risk ones, your thinner sheep that aren't sort of that aren't ancient. Your two and your younger sheep probably, your yearlings, you're going to have low levels of antibodies. So 2, 3+ sheep that are thinner. And also a reminder about NSA Welsh sheep on the 21st of May, just north of Brecon. Hope lots of people will be there. Yes, I think Wales Veterinary Science Centre will probably have a stand there, and Welsh sheep vets as well.
Lovely. Well, I think we could bring it to a close now. So thank you very much, Kate, for a detailed and interesting presentation. I'm sure we've all picked up a few tips and learned something tonight. And thank you everybody for joining us. I will be sending out a feedback form for this webinar. So I would be really grateful if you can complete it, and do let us know if there's any other topics you'd like to see us cover. And I will be sending out a short survey that HCC's currently got on water baseline. There's a chance for you to win a waterproof farming smock. So for those of you that are interested, the link will be in the email with the feedback form. So once again, thank you everyone for joining. Diolch yn fawr am ymuno ni a nos da. Good night.